Good afternoon, everyone. I think we're going to go ahead and get started. Thank you so much for attending today's event on inclusive criminology featuring Professor Kwan-Lamar Blount-Hill from Arizona State University. This event is a joint venture between the Deason Criminal Justice Reform Center and the Indigent Defense Research Association, or IDRA. My name is Jiacheng Yu. I'm a policy attorney at the Deason Center, and I am the moderator for today's program. I'm going to just say a couple of words about the Deason Center, and then I will turn it over to Stephen to do a quick intro of IDRA, and then we'll get on with our featured program. The Deason Center is a nonpartisan policy, research, and advocacy center housed at SMU Dedman School of Law, which is in Dallas. We use a stats and stories approach to smart, sane, and sensible criminal legal reform. And our expertise is focused on Sixth Amendment right and access to counsel. So our major research areas focus on pretrial due process and early stage criminal procedure, STAR justice, which is small tribal and rural criminal justice systems, and prosecutorial discretion. As we work with both empirical and legal research involving some of the most vulnerable people in our society, we find it very important to discuss who and how the research is conducted, as well as how traditionally silent voices can be lifted and encouraged in this space. As a result, the Deason Center has begun a range of efforts and events discussing pipelines for scholars of color to enter the academy. Last time we were here together with IDRA in the spring, we had a great discussion about how to increase the diversity of scholars studying indigent defense. And we are very excited to continue in that discussion today with our discussion about inclusive criminology. So now I'm going to turn it over to Stephen to say a couple of words about IDRA.
Yeah, thanks very much. Very, very happy to be here along with the Deason Center and our IDRA community. This is, as you heard, not the first event we've done with the Deason Center, and hopefully not the last. And we've also received a lot of support from the Deason Center just running IDRA over the course of becoming what we are today. So we're always grateful for that support. And Deason being sort of the place where we've hosted so many of even just our IDRA calls. So IDRA is it rhymes with Hydra, as we say, to connote an entity that is many-headed, fierce, and hard to kill. We are multidisciplinary, virtual. We have practitioners, researchers, funders, policy analysts, anybody who works around indigent defense, specifically who want to improve public defense and think about how to do that using empirical research and how research plays a role in improving how defense works. We've been around for a while. It's hard to remember exactly how long, but certainly I've been involved since something like 2016 anyway. So yeah, it's great to be a part of IDRA, and it's great to be here with the Deason Center. If you're interested in IDRA and you're not already a member, please check out our website, indigentdefenseresearch.org. And there will be a link to join our listserv, to see our roundup of monthly publications, etc. And also feel free to just reach out to me at any point. I'm happy to talk about IDRA and what we do. But without further ado, I'll turn it back to Jiacheng to introduce our speaker. And again, very, very excited to be here and for this really important topic.
Thank you, Stephen. All right, now I will very briefly introduce our speaker because I'm sure you want to hear from him and not me. Let's see. Okay. I'm very, very honored to introduce Dr. Kwan-Lamar Blount-Hill, who is an assistant professor at the School of Criminology. I apologize. I somehow got kicked off the presentation, and I will restart. Dr. Kwan-Lamar Blount-Hill is an assistant professor at the School of Criminology and Criminal Justice at Arizona State University. He is a social identity researcher blended narrative and social identity theory into explanations of intergroup conflicts in criminal legal contexts. He has also applied series of social dominance and subordination to explain human ecology interactions and used identity theories for explaining subjects ranging from criminal stigma to international queer theory. He is a former police officer, firefighter, and licensed attorney. He has studied environmental science, law, and criminal justice, worked for the New York City's Mayor's Office of Criminal Justice, as well as the Brooklyn Prosecutor's Office. He has researched in academic, government, and community settings, and identifies as Black, queer, and Christian in a multiracial, interfaith, multinational family. In his own words, Kwan himself is a case study in inclusive criminology, and we are very excited to have him here with us today. Throughout the presentation, I want to invite you to drop questions or comments in the chat or the Q&A box. We appreciate you being in this space to listen, learn, and share, and we remind everyone to be respectful and clear in your comments and questions. Without further ado, I will turn it over to Professor Blount-Hill for his presentation.
Hello. I'm very, very excited to be sharing some of my work, some of my thoughts with you, but most importantly, to be a part of an ongoing conversation that you all are having. I'm very, very excited about this. I see that the date has not updated on my presentation, so I apologize for the incorrect date. This is really discussion oriented. I myself, as one of the things that was mentioned, has been legally trained. And so I'm used to being in a classroom where professors ask questions back, students are able to ask questions. At least for the first part of our discussion, I'll be talking mostly and kind of giving you some background on the thoughts that will anchor our discussion. But I definitely expect this to be a very important back and forth between you all and myself and amongst you all and inclusive of me. I will say, I know that in the intro, I told you already quite a bit about myself, and obviously I helped to craft that intro. So all the, kind of jargony words that you heard Jie-Ching say, that's like me. But one of the important things I think that I'll highlight as I'm going through this talk is how important identity is for how we structure and generate the research that we do, but also then the findings that come from it. And then of course now the body of knowledge that is built on the findings of many, many different researchers, all conglomerated into one. And so if you take as a given that the identity and the biography of the researcher was, at least in some ways, important for how the research was structured, then that means that our body of knowledge is essentially boiled down to a collection of biographical contributions from all these researchers, right? Usually you're having findings of research that was done by a person. And to the extent that they're now reporting their experience and interpretations of their experience, even if it is the interpretation of data gathered during their experience, their identity is incredibly important then to the generation of that research, to the interpretation of it, to what it means. And then that means then that the body of knowledge or the bodies of knowledge that we're analyzing and making use of and applying in our daily lives and policy work, et cetera, really do boil down to how that research was generated from a certain body of people. And the composition of that body of folks becomes really, really important then to understanding what we know or think that we know of the world. And what that means is that when certain identities are excluded from that, which is the basis of what we'll be talking about, they are not represented in that body of knowledge. They are not represented in what it is that we think we understand about the world. And that really is the core of the entire argument that I'll be talking about today, which is that those experiences, right, both from the researcher standpoint, but also from those who are researched, becomes really, really important to include in order to make sure that those bodies of knowledge that we have about all sorts of things from medicine to how politics works are reflective of the varying experiences of humans across the globe and across history. So I'll start now to jump into my formal talk and introduce myself, Kwan Blount-Hill. There's lots of names up on the screen. Kwan will be fine for today. And this talk, particularly my thoughts about the criminal law really was inspired and will be heavily inspired by work that I had done. This is a picture of Baku, Azerbaijan. Baku is the capital of Azerbaijan. Azerbaijan is a country in the South Caucasus, so in Georgia, Armenia area. Russia also is part of that, that region. And I was doing work there to establish, or to help begin establish criminological work on what we were calling this Caucasian criminology project. Caucasian, of course, referring to the South Caucasus region, and really focused on the interesting and unique mix of cultures and histories of the nations there, and how that may have important factors or important contributions to the factors that then dictate things like crime rates, what even is considered a crime, what is considered acceptable social behavior, issues and attitudes about fairness and justice, and how those things are really shaped within a regional, cultural, political, international context. In that project, at the end of it, I returned home and was then invited by the Baku State University Law School, their law department, to contribute a chapter on the actual problems of criminal law. Now, by that time, I'd already done some of my work on inclusive criminology, much of the work that I'll be talking with you about today. But it was the first time that I was now like returning, I suppose, to my legal educational roots and trying to decide how inclusiveness and diversity, particularly within the research realm, impacted not the kind of more general theoretical social sciences that I'm used to doing most of my work in, but a very applied science, right, which is research and empirical scholarship within the legal realm. And so in thinking about that, first of all, you get kind of the answers that you would get from a social scientist, right? First, I'm thinking, all right, here are some definitions. Let me lay out definitions. I'll say defining things is actually probably something I got more from my legal education than the social science education, as you can read lots and lots of our papers, reading, you know, one particular jargony word and never ever get a definition of that word. But for me, I wanted to understand, well, why is it that empirics would even be important in the legal realm? And what are we talking about that overlaps what we do as more general social scientists with what empirical legal researchers do? And so first, you have this definition of knowledge itself, and I think we're kind of in the way of me seeing the slides, but this understanding or awareness of a subject that you can reasonably or justifiably believe to be true. Knowledge itself is generated, usually really protected by this body of folks we call the academy. That's the organized group of people who are mostly engaged in the profession of maintaining and advancing global societal knowledge. Now, we know that we think that they have this job because we keep sending our kids to be educated by them and to get the really basic understanding of the world by folks like us. And so we presume that of all the institutions, universities and kind of the higher educational system, and then of course down to our secondary and primary education systems, are really the keepers of what that knowledge is and responsible for making sure that knowledge transfers from us to future generations, which is why you get so many of the journal articles and you have to take so many courses to be certified as knowing something, right? This academy is made up of academics and is populated with all sorts of academic stuff like academic buildings and academic institutions, which primarily, in addition to their transfer function, right, their function of teaching, are also involved in generating what that body of knowledge is, right? So scholarship is just this academic level of research that advances discovery and integration, application, and of course, teaching of knowledge. And finally, for just one more definition at you, but again, I'm talking to many lawyers, so you're used to being thrown out, you know, having a statute begin with a bunch of definitions up front. That when I say empirical, I'm talking about any sort of like disciplined, systematic attempt of understanding something by observation or some sort of, sorry, I'm trying to read my definition now. Observation or some other way of acquiring facts about how it is that the phenomena that you're studying, in fact, that our world actually works, right? And so unlike, say, for instance, philosophers who may be thinking about logically how things should work if things worked in a logical world, I'm usually trying to figure out, well, what is actually happening here? Accounting for all the illogical or other aspects of a phenomenon that one may or may not expect. I want to be able to describe a phenomenon in like incredibly detailed, but also incredibly factual. I'd like to actually be able to describe a phenomenon so well that when you then experience completely outside of my presence and in your own life, it fits my definition, right? My description. As I was preparing for this contribution, I began to read up a lot on empirical legal scholarship and came upon this framework of empirical jurisprudence, which I'll generally introduce very quickly here and then come back to at the end of my remarks. But the gist of it is that legal research should more often embrace a methodology of social sciences to a greater extent. And that's not to say that it should do that instead of what is typically done in legal research, which is a lot of doctrinal analysis and analyzing the kind of findings or the holdings of cases and how they've applied and evolved over time. That should probably remain the core of what legal scholarship does, right? And what legal scholars do. And so this is not a social scientist telling you, well, you should be more like me. But this is me saying that as a social scientist, you should use my skills more, because in combination with what it is that most legal scholars are actually doing, it can enhance what we're doing in the legal realm. There were really two aims that the empirical jurisprudence scholars pointed to. One, that we should be able to look at and really map the rhetorical strategies that establish how persuasion succeeds or fails. So how is it that you make a case and that people accept that case? And that's a lot of what we do in the legal field. And so you need a lot of research focusing on that, but also that there should be greater attention to predicting the impact of legal rules and forecasting where the law is going, including, for instance, through judicial outcomes, but perhaps other legal processes as well. So, of course, my answer then was that when thinking about and when called on to think about, well, what are some of the actual current problems that need to be resolved or addressed within criminal law? My answer was, of course, what you might expect to get from a social scientist like myself. So you need more social science. We need more science, more of the work of giving an organized account of what is true about the universe and about our world, more empirical work, so that while lawyers like yourselves in many cases can tell us what the law is and what the law should be, that you have the skills of scientists to come in to help determine how the law is actually made, how the law actually works, and what impact the law actually has in the world, and what impacts we might actually expect in the future if we take one versus another course of action. I hope all that makes sense. However, an exclusive science can do none of that stuff. A science that excludes certain perspectives, that doesn't take into account fully the human experience, cannot do any of the things that I just said social scientists would be helpful in doing. So, for instance, in trying to understand the impact of raising the, let's say, cost or the criminal punishment penalties of a particular crime that is itself concentrated, at least as reported by criminal justice officials within certain communities, if you exclude the experiences of those communities, you're not talking with them or understanding, say, some of the cultural or situational, circumstantial reasons why certain behaviors are engaged in, you can't really predict how they'll respond to increasing the penalty of a particular law. In some cases, for instance, some cultural settings might dictate that people don't react to it much at all. If my culture or my circumstances or the social structures around me dictate that I must engage in a certain behavior in order to accomplish really basic human needs, like just simply acquiring the economic resources that I need, then it doesn't really matter what the increases of the penalties in your law are. I'm still going to engage in the behaviors I need to engage in order to acquire the resources that I need. And for you to understand that, that would require you to talk to me and to understand me if I'm in the community that you're hoping to impact, right? And so a science that doesn't account for those perspectives can't really let you know what to expect as we make one choice here or do one application there, or select from a number of policy options. You need to have as inclusive a science as possible so that you can be much more precise in understanding what will happen when you, for instance, raise a criminal penalty. So by way of example, just considering the impact of identity on science. When I speak about identity, I'm talking about that set of traits and characteristics that distinguish an individual as unique. So if you think about who are you and what makes you different than me, that's what I'm talking about when I talk about identity. This is made up of traits and motives and narratives, at least from the identity tradition that I draw most of my work from. And so by traits, I'm talking about qualities of an individual. So if you want to describe me, then you might talk about things like, well, you know, he tends to be very nerdy. Maybe he tends to really like to read and study. He tends to be testy, for instance. That's not a true statement, I would say, but some might. You also need to know something about my motives, right? The things that cause me or drive me to feel, to act, to react in certain ways because I am trying to attain something. Right now, for instance, a lot of the behavior that I display in this talk is motivated by my desire that this be a meaningful talk, that the audience be engaged, that you feel like you learned something or that you didn't waste your time in hearing from me. And narratives. These are these storied understandings of self across time. The story that I tell about myself as a scholar will impact how I weave a continuing tale for my future. And my understanding of how I got to this moment will be really important to understanding why it is that I decided to move forward in the way that I do, either going down this path or this particular path. And so understanding someone's narrative is core to understanding their identity. Two other aspects of identity that I would say are really, really important, and actually many scholars would say are really important, are the understanding of the convergence of both personal and social identity within a person. So with all those things I just said about traits, motives, and narratives, interacting with all of those are the idea that I have a definition of myself that separates me from others, but I also have a definition of myself that encompasses me along with others. And in fact, you have definitions of both me, perhaps, if you know me well enough, but certainly the groups that I belong to. And you may make certain assumptions about what you can expect from those groups, and you would expect that I would adhere to a lot of what we've come to expect from certain categories. So because you know that I'm a professor, you will expect certain things of me that are in line with your expectations of a professor. So just looking at my personal and social identity, for instance, I describe myself as a Black man, right? But that may have had some impacts. It can have a bunch of different impacts on how one acts, but that is probably in some ways related to some extent on some what one might call Afrophilia, right? This idea of like, oh, I really love Black culture and understanding things about my history. And that's partly at least influenced probably by my Blackness. That I identify as a queer man probably has some impacts on my behavior and how I understand the world. But of course, my own kind of cisgenderedness that sets me apart from people who are not cisgendered will also have those really important impacts. I already mentioned the fact that I have been raised very Christian, right, from a very religious household. And so that has some impacts on my thoughts about the spiritual world and how important it is to be in tune with certain things. And I imagine that that background is really important to how I understand the world around me. I'm an academic, and so I'm curious about a lot of things and I'm likely to ask a lot of questions. And of course, coming at my work as an inclusive criminologist means that I approach the world in a certain way. So that is influenced by other traits as well, right? Things like nerdiness or being really intense in my interests, sometimes being easygoing. These are all going to have an impact on people's ability to work with me, the projects I can even work on, the people who will talk to me, what I'm likely to get from an interviewee, for instance, if I conduct interviews. It will shape the data that I'm able to draw, and thus will absolutely shape the findings that are possible given the data that I have. And thus the knowledge, right? My contribution to that body of knowledge I was talking about earlier are absolutely going to be impacted by the personal traits that I have, or impacted by the personal motives that I have, right? Motives about social justice or public service, or the desire even for security and liberty, even in my own life, right? Things like me being concerned about having a job that pays me adequately enough that I don't have to worry about paying my bills will influence the jobs I'm likely to take, thus influencing the resources I have, access to, and thus influencing now, again, the contributions I can make to the general body knowledge. And then there's all sorts of narratives I have about myself, about being a member of my family, about the schools that I've gone to and what it means to have been a part of those legacies. The work that I've done in the public safety arena or some of the agencies that I worked with, even down to personal things like the narrative of the life that I've weaved with my own partner, are all going to have an influence on the types of things that I work on, that I choose to work on, that are important to me, and thus what my contributions to a body of knowledge will be. I've worked on a couple different things at this point, a lot of things about context and intergroup legitimation. I've looked at open, transparent, inclusive designs, drawn on social identity theory to explain things like how it is that groups themselves come up with shared narratives that shape how they interpret the world, or how it is that individuals come together as social groups to determine whether it's in their interest to comply with or work in cooperation with ecological schemes in order to boost wildlife biodiversity. I have focused on what I would call a policy relevant criminology and how you use policy and apply it to enhance criminal justice outcomes. All of these things may be influenced by all sorts of aspects of my biography and how I come to the world to have made me select those particular topics as things of interest to me, including inclusive criminology, which I have to imagine is in part rooted by my own experience as a scholar who identifies as part of, let's say, a marginalized group within the academy. And so when I talk about inclusive criminology, and I promise I'm now getting to the point where we're about to go into a place where you can talk a bit as well, I'm talking about a perspective on knowledge, a theory of knowledge, a theory about what it is that we know and how we know it. I'm talking about a perspective that's accounting for and addressing issues of justice. This is the recognition of rights or of what is deserved. When we say justice and what we mean by justice, at least when I say the word, that's what I'm thinking about. I'm thinking about how it is that we make sure that people get what it is that they deserve. I'm talking about issues of informational justice. This is the recognition of one's rights and of what one deserves as a seeker, a source, or a subject of information. As a person who wants access to information, but also wants to provide information, because I want my perspectives, my experience to be reflected in the body of information that's out there, and as a person of interest to others who might be studied himself. That in all these aspects of how I relate to information and my contribution to global information, that issues of justice are relevant. And as an inclusive criminologist, I'm coming from the premise that researchers, scholars should be focused on or concentrate at least some of their attention to issues of epistemic justice. Now that word has been used by lots of people, and not just myself, certainly. Has been used to mean a couple of different things. In many, many formulations of it, we're talking a little bit more about the individual rights to informational justice, some of the things that I talked about just earlier as I explained the definition of informational justice. But I am also talking about a group-based right and a collective right as well, a society's right. The right that we all, as a group of people together, have to valid and reliable knowledge. That as a society, as part of the social contract, I am arguing that we're also saying that we should be able to make decisions, particularly in systems of government that involve democracy and rely on the decision-making ability of a general citizenry, that in those societies, having a right to valid and reliable knowledge is a core part of that social contract. In fact, it's why we want our governments, for instance, to be transparent. It's why we have laws on the books like FOIA and others that allow you to get access to government records. It's why you have to sign all these terms and conditions, and contract terms need to be written out explicitly on some instrument that demonstrates a meeting of the minds. It is because you have a right to make decisions on accurate knowledge. And I would argue, and I have argued, that inclusiveness and inclusive science, and in my case, an inclusive criminology, is absolutely essential. It's a must-have, is a prerequisite and precondition to your ability as a society and as an individual to have valid and reliable knowledge. And so essentially, it's an epistemic, right? A kind of theory of knowledge approach, but also a methodological approach that emphasizes just more sources of knowledge, more subjects of knowledge. Study more things, draw data from more things, draw more perspectives, and seek as much as possible to integrate. And so I'm constantly, and if you ever read my work, and if you decide that you are interested in it, you'll see that I'm usually drawing and attempting to draw from bodies of knowledge across disciplines, and often trying to bring them together in some framework that works. In fact, it is possible that you could read my work at one point in my career and see in just a couple of years, me having had great evolutions or alterations of thought, because I'm constantly also revising and critiquing my own work. I think I have on record, even in certain publications, times where I've gone back and said, hey, I think I defined something one way a couple of years ago. I would actually define it a totally different way. I think that prior definition is inadequate. Because I think as an inclusive criminologist, to absorbing more and more information, what I understand is that we're all trying to explain and operate in this one world. This one world that we experience differently, but that actually does have factors and phenomena that impact on all of us. And if that's the case, then to truly understand even my own experience in this world, I absolutely have to understand yours, because your experiences are what are driving your actions that then impact me. And so I cannot truly understand why it is that my life is the way it is without understanding why it is that your life is the way that yours is. And so some scientific questions then on indigent defense that I think a social scientist asks more generally, and how we can, as social scientists, contribute to the work that you all are doing, are questions about how laws and legal practices are actually come up with or actually made. We know that there's a legal process. I took civics class, I went to law school and learned in my constitutional law courses, but there are other things like that, for instance, the sociology of law would teach us that impact how laws are actually made, and certainly that impact then how those laws influence legal practice. How do these laws and practices actually work? What impacts do they have, not just in terms of the law and the body of the law, or even in terms of the practice of the law, but what impacts more broadly do those practices and laws have, and what should we expect given our knowledge? This all goes to this idea of evidence-based practice, which is premised on the idea that decisions and actions should be based on empirical evidence, because that will increase effectiveness and efficiency. And I admit that for this discussion, I am taking as a given, and I haven't proved the point, I'm just making an assumption, that we all want to improve the effectiveness and efficiency of indigent defense in the practice of it, because that improves and enhances what we're able to provide to the various clients that we have. And so taking an inclusive approach to that requires us to ask a couple of benchmark questions, really kind of scrutinizing questions about what sources of information do we need, what more sources can we look at? And this is sources of information with regard to data, but this is also how can we collect data in different ways? How can we analyze it in different ways? How can we interpret what we get from that data in different ways that reveal different things, even about the same information points, and even as we look for other information points. So as a person who worked at a district attorney's office as their lead researcher, I know that I talked a lot and analyzed a lot about some of the numeric things that we were able to find, collecting all sorts of information on how processes were moving through our criminal court system there in Brooklyn. But there were all sorts of other information points that we might have drawn on to influence our practice. And so as an inclusive criminologist, I need to be thinking about that stuff. I need to be thinking that in an office like we were in Brooklyn, that says that we want to be a progressive prosecution office, that really having just information on, say, things like conviction rates and the number of cases that we currently get, that would have been adequate for previous offices. But as we came in, we had to begin to think about, well, wait a minute, we're actually measuring ourselves on a different set of scales. We now need more information, different information that is reflective of that. As an inclusive criminologist, I'm also asking what subjects should we focus on? And what are the additional subjects that we haven't put enough attention to? Things like, what are still further research questions that have yet to get our attention? What are the research populations that have yet to have our attention as a scholarly world? And are we being epistemically just? Are we, in fact, as we're going through that process of expanding our knowledge and expanding the scope of our research activities, are we doing it in such a way that acknowledges society's right to valid and reliable knowledge? And what that means is, one, that we're being inclusive of as many experiences as possible so that our science is as comprehensive as possible and as accurate as possible, that it accurately reflects the diversity of human experience. But also in terms of once we establish or acquire that knowledge that comes from the science that I'm talking about, who has access to it? How do they get access to it? Who has the power to use it and to leverage and to apply scientific knowledge in order to advance their interests, particularly those interests that are justice concerns, right? Things that they deserve and that they have a right to. And I would suggest that we need to be focused, as equally focused on that. And with that, I will conclude my remarks.
Thank you so much. That definitely gave me, at least me, a lot of food for thought. And at this time, we would open up for discussion. And I think what I would want, if you have a question or comment, you can raise your hand, or you can send a message to me, and I'm happy to moderate that. I see that Andy already has his hands up. So Andy, if you want to ask a question or make a comment.
Yeah, thank you so much, Professor. This has been really thought-provoking. And thank you so much also for coming to our community to talk about indigent defense and really just addressing that topic head on. I appreciate that. And I didn't know you were going to do it. I had just a lot of thoughts. I think the last, I'll just ask you about the last one that I had, which is, I wonder if you could speak to accountability for researchers. And what's on my mind, and I'm really asking this in an open and naive way, is to the extent that we in our work, in the place that I work now and other places, have involved members of justice impacted communities directly in our research. We've done it in their capacity as advisory board members, and we've done it in their capacity as employees. We have formerly incarcerated people working on data collection. And families of incarcerated people. One thing that I've realized is that it did a lot of good for our culture as a research team, but it also, and I didn't know it was going to do this, created a sort of a reciprocal accountability on us. It became totally obvious when we were interviewing a gentleman for a position on a project who was formerly incarcerated. And we asked him directly about the fact, about how comfortable he would be going into a criminal justice institution as a part of his research. And he immediately told us about the time that he had to report a laptop stolen to the very police station where he had previously been arrested and wrongfully incarcerated, and how this might be traumatizing. It made me realize that being inclusive also imparted responsibilities on us to then be mindful that simply inviting people into the room wasn't just to enrich us, it created a relationship among us. And I felt that there was a layer of accountability on us to then live up to that relationship. I just wonder if you could speak to this idea of accountability and if that resonates with anything that comes up for you.
Oh, it definitely does. And I'm gonna kind of do the professorial thing and like now layer in a bunch of different answers to all sorts of aspects of what you just talked about. One, I would say, so the presentation and the focus of the idea that I've been kind of trying to develop, and I say trying to develop, I'm certainly not the only person who's talked about diversity. Obviously, we know that even within criminology. But I think that there's at least two major approaches to talking about issues of inclusion and diversity, which is the focus on the kind of moral aspect of it with regard to the person, right? What do we owe each other? What do we owe the people who are involved? And so there is accountability in that way. And I think some of what you described is that too, right? That I deserve to be represented, whether it adds anything to your research enterprise or not. I deserve to be represented in, issues of discussion where my communities are impacted. I deserve to be represented just generally as a human. Wherever humans deserve to be represented, I am one of them. And so that deserves representation there from a moral and ethical basis. And then there's kind of the approach of looking at it either with regard to the morality of the science itself, so like what is it about knowledge, and what are kind of the moral questions with regard to that outside of what we are concerned about with regard to like human personalities and humans as individuals, and this more utilitarian, say, focus on like just having really, really accurate science because we think that that's good. And I think that there's accountability there as well, right? So there's the accountability of making sure that the science and the research that we're generating is the best research that we can get. It's really, really accurate. And there's some things that resonated even on that with your story, right? Things like, oh, wait, that impact on a researcher of having to go to some place that they had been previously arrested and wrongfully arrested, that alerts you a little bit to the trauma of that, right? It provides you some idea of like how important that trauma is. It may make you think about other things like, well, wait, are we meeting research respondents there? Are there other aspects where we didn't think about trauma there? Are there even other instances where in both the conduct of research or in the position that we're placing our researchers that we haven't considered the various traumas? In fact, if this researcher can be impacted by their trauma, are there traumas I have that have nothing to do with his experience, but maybe other experiences that could be impacting the decisions I'm making with regard to this research project, things that I don't even consider because maybe, my trauma is in line with the types of trauma that other people would have, right? It's not really criminal justice involved. It's maybe aligned with other members of my team. And so it's highlighted less. But when I now go back to scrutinize, I'm able to see that, oh, wait, there's some other ways that this work is impacting me that could be impacting the knowledge itself, right? And so I think that there's a lot of opportunity there to create these layers of accountability as that inclusion, as that circle, let's say, or sphere of inclusion increases. One thing I would also say, though, is, and I would really want to highlight, is that I'm really happy that y'all had a process and an open environment that allowed for a researcher to feel comfortable telling you and revealing their discomfort there. And in fact, obviously give you kudos for having asked the question itself. One of the things that we learn for anybody who's really studying these processes of what are the benefits, say, of diversification, say, of a workplace or a working group or any sort of like group that's tackling a task, is the fact that actually the benefits of diversity and inclusion are something of maybe something of a bell curve or polarized, right? So it's not that more diversity is necessarily always better. It actually is only better under certain conditions. It's only better in a condition in which we actually have a process where people are able to have their views represented, where people are actually able to negotiate what makes everybody feel included and a part and what makes a space welcoming to them. Actually, if you don't intend to have processes that truly welcome folks, then actually having a lot of diversity just breeds a lot of conflict. If you bring me into a space where I don't feel comfortable, but you needed to have someone of my hue in that space, I'm likely to feel uncomfortable there. And I am likely to be a source of conflict for you. And so I really like the fact that your comments opened up the possibilities or the opportunity to talk about the fact that if we want to have a much more inclusive research space, we also have to really, really focus on how to make the environment such that it incorporates and welcomes those identities and those voices. And more generally, that we have a process of conflict management, because we're not going to be able to anticipate exactly how to make a space feel welcome. In part, you also have to talk to me about it. So as one last point, and then I will turn over the floor to others that I know I've talked already. But in as we, professors, we make these statements as we're trying to get jobs, these diversity statements, say, here's how we'll incorporate and think about diversity in our classrooms. And one of the things that I highlighted in my diversity statement, and I make a mention of it anytime I'm talking about topics like this, was that, yes, I'm going to try to be really, really well informed. I'm going to try to understand exactly where we are as a culture, for instance, on issues of gender identity and how to address it in the classroom, other things that are fast changing, right? What are the terms to talk about a group? How do I deal with the very like wide variety, for instance, within the Asian diaspora that I'm likely to find in my classroom? How am I sensitive to that? How do I deal with differential abilities within my student base, right? And people who need certain accommodations. And one of the things that I was quick to highlight was to say, I'm going to try to be really well informed on this, but the most important thing I'm going to do is create an environment where my students can let me know what they need. I mean, the most important thing is going to be to make sure that there's a process that if I hadn't read the book yet that told me about the new way that we're addressing this issue, and there's so many things out there and so many things that are changing that I can't possibly know exactly all the information I need to know on how we as a society are dealing with these issues of identity. And in fact, actually, I still don't know what the individuals in my class feel. So you might have just learned a bunch of things about how to be racially sensitive to Black Americans, but that does not mean that I agree with the things that you learned. And so those things may not apply to me, that you have to have a process where I can be open, where I can say the things that are concerning for me, where you can now truly welcome me in that space. It's only then that you get the benefit of having this more inclusive team that not just adds to the moral force of the work that you're doing, that you are accounting for the potential traumas that you may impact or impose if you conduct research in a certain way, but you're also being able to now account for the ways that that understanding can improve your understanding of what it is that you're actually studying. Right? In this case, for instance, the many and sometimes unanticipated guises under which trauma impacts the work and the knowledge that we're able to generate. I probably gave you a way longer response than you were expecting with your comments, Andy, but thank you.
It's very welcome. Thank you very much.
Can I just follow up on that? Because you just talk about the way how you could build a more inclusive environment. What have you seen or heard as some of the, I would say, like top challenges to creating that environment, especially in the current societal and political atmosphere where, I mean, of course, thinking about the affirmative action case that was recently decided, that's very disheartening, as well as, say, in Texas, there's a push to ban diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives in public schools as well. So I'm just curious to see what your thoughts are on that.
Sure, and so I'll give my thoughts. I'll start off by saying I don't technically focus most of my research and study in the area of what are the top problems of diversity. It's something I read about and incorporate a lot, but I don't necessarily study that. So as I talk, I'm speaking from my own personal experience as a professional, person who's worked in this space, but I'm essentially now coming to the level of my own experience, right? So don't take anything I'm saying as like, oh, there's a citable study that suggests that he's right on this. But from my experience, some of the top things, and when I've worked with organizations, I've now worked with several of them on either collaborative problem solving, so we're actually tackling some sort of issues, or just in like multi-identity collaborations. One has been people's misunderstandings, right? And so just like being, for lack of a better term, just sort of like quite ignorant to identities outside of yourself sets you up to have lots and lots of conflicts with people that could easily be avoided if you just try to expose yourself more to the various identities that you are likely to encounter as you go about whatever task or work you do. But the other is to not have the skills then to negotiate those misunderstandings. That to me is like the next problem. Hey, I did something to offend you and I don't have the skills to draw that out of you or to approach you about it, to apologize. I don't have the maturity, for instance, to take responsibility for that, nor the maturity or the skills to navigate that with you. Oftentimes, by the way, conflicts are not just the right and wrong. They actually require some education on my part, right? If I offended you, I may actually need to have you educate me as to why. Why did you think the tone of my voice suggested that I thought X? Or why did you think when I said I didn't like that idea that I thought it was, say, stupid versus it just wasn't optimal, or I thought that I had another one? And how can we avoid this? I think that that's been a major issue that I've encountered as I've done this work or work in similar areas. And then finally, I will say to not have the organizational culture in place to support that interpersonal interaction, right? So the organizational processes, and again, the organizational culture. So I say culture is composed of both kind of our formal processes for things. Say there was a conflict within the team, we need to have a process we go through. We have a team meeting, we have a discussion, people get pulled off to the side. We have some way of dealing with and managing conflict as a team, but also to say that, and we buy into that, right? So that the values are really important too, that everyone is supportive of that process, that we're collaborative within that process, that we really do want to resolve conflicts. We really do want to come to a convergence of interests. I would say those to me tend to be the top 3 issues you run into right away when a team that has a lot of diversity of various types, right? So I've focused quite a bit on racial diversity because that's usually the point on which I'm most diverse, but I myself encompass diversity of other types, and most teams do as well. That includes diversity of perspective, of opinion, of lived experience, despite sometimes even sharing racial or sexual identities with others. And in those situations, either not knowing a lot or being exposed to a lot of information about their identities, then not having the skills to navigate the pitfalls that come from that lack of knowledge, and then not having an organizational and procedural kind of structure in place that supports me being able to resolve those conflicts, have often been at the heart of many of the more intractable problems that it seems like some of those teams were unable to get over.
Thank you very much. I think I have definitely experienced some of these deficiencies, I think, in the workplace. We have a question from Ms. Tatiana Klein.
Hi, thank you so much for your presentation. So I'm in California and I do a lot of trainings myself on like microaggressions and the inner work of racial justice. And when I start talking, so when I get to the question parts, the thing that always comes up is that there's a real fear when I ask people to really do like a look in the mirror approach and to like have open and honest discussions. I talk a lot about like using mindfulness techniques and stuff like that to like really recognize like, why are you uncomfortable with this situation? Kind of things that you're talking about, right? Like if I'm uncomfortable or in asking the hard questions. And then I sometimes get pushback from people because there's this real fear of saying the wrong thing and then like getting canceled, right? And I get it, and it's a real fear. And so I would just love to know your thoughts on that, because what I try to explain to people is like, you got to do the work, right? Like we're all going to make mistakes. I make so many mistakes. I've said the wrong thing so many times, but it's like you learn from it, you recognize, and then you hope you never make the mistake again. But I always get this hesitation of like the fear of starting the work, right? Because people also, I think, don't want to look inside themselves and like acknowledge that they've done harm, right? Yeah. Because I think we all have, like, it's just, we learn it. Like we learn to harm other people, right? So I would just love to know your thoughts on like this fear from people who really don't want to say the wrong thing, kind of, or look inside themselves and like get canceled.
Yeah, I mean, thank you for that question, Tatiana. And then again, I'll say most of my actual research is focused on explaining why the work that you do is important, more so than explaining like how to handle the work that you do. So you're much more likely more of an expert in this area than I am. But I think the best scenario, and hopefully you find yourself in this scenario, is that you're in with a group of people and right up front, you can establish that, hey, we're going to have an open and honest like process or stage for dialogue. Hey, right off, you person who I may or may not offend, and I think we can all be offended. So there's often the sense that that just because I have one or another identities that like everyone has to be only sensitive towards me. I have to say that I've been mostly working in say just plainly white spaces, and I think a lot about offending my white colleagues. So I am not the only person who is who you have to account for offending. Like I too am having to really watch what I say and make sure that I'm not being offensive in really important ways. So I think that's important to say because we are now all sharing that burden. So no one should enter into a space where you have multiple identities and feel like you're the only one burdened with having to be careful and having to navigate. In fact, it may feel more like a burden for you only because this is relatively new for you, whereas I've had that burden essentially since I was born. And so I think that that's really important to highlight because we're all coming to a space trying to figure each other out and to navigate. And if we can start as a group, the best scenario I would say is to start as a group acknowledging that navigation process, that like, actually, this is not a process where we all know exactly what to say. And this is just a system of figuring out when you didn't do what you were supposed to do. You knew that you were supposed to do this and you didn't, or you knew that you shouldn't have said that and you didn't say it. No, I'm assuming that you would like to know, thus you are trying to learn, thus you're not gonna make, a lot of offensive, say, comments, moves, behaviors, things that suggest that you're just comfortable in ignorance. I'm gonna assume, and hopefully you're gonna, in good faith, try not to be ignorant to how we should interact. But then once we get from that premise and assumption, now we're in this process of dialogue. And actually a lot of it is you have to learn from me. Part of it is you have to build a relationship with me. You need to build a relationship with me that allows me to learn from you and to learn what you do and do not like in the same way that I build relationships with all sorts of other people and all sorts of other aspects of my life. And you have to be willing to ask and question me about what I do and do not like. And by the way, one of the important things and that we don't consider within a relationship, all right, and that is what we have as we're working as a group, even if it's temporary and even if it's very constrained to a certain aspect of our lives, is a negotiation process as well, right? So that like, you can't really have a functional relationship if you, the person who needs to learn, completely cedes your power to negotiate too. You too have to say, hey, Kwan, I really want to be sensitive to making sure that you feel welcome and included. But I am a human, other person. And so like, I also have my own needs in this. Like, I don't know a lot about how to make you feel welcome in this space, for instance, Kwan. So I'm gonna need you to like help me with that. I recognize that like historically that's a burden on you, but like there's unfortunately no other way than to be asked this additional burden of you explaining how to make you feel welcome. And the only thing I can actually do, I maybe say less hypothetical white person in this situation, since that's usually kind of like how these things get set up. I know that I'm placing this burden on you, Kwan, to help walk me through this. I'm just going to be sensitive to the fact that you have that extra burden. I'm just trying to like let you know that I recognize it and that I understand I'm asking this of you, but I am asking this of you. And if you can do it this one time, you'll stop other Black people from having to do it later, even though I'll still have to learn their particular preferences. And so every time I encounter some new person, I simply need to establish a basis that we need to be learning from each other. I don't know if that was a lot of words that didn't boil down to some like a more succinct takeaway, but I think that having that process of interaction and interactive learning, interactive dialogue, it sounds actually, now that I'm saying it, when you boil it down, it sounds so simple that it's something that we all know, but I think it's absolutely critical. And if you're coming from a place of fear that stops you from dialogue, that is the thing that's likely to cause the conflict, right? Like that stoppage of our ability to negotiate, like your fear of stepping on the, in the wrong kind of pothole, that's probably gonna be why you step in, right? Because you didn't ask what potholes look like or where they are. And so now you're much more likely to be navigating in ignorance. And you don't have to do that, hopefully in most cases.
Thank you so much.
We have an anonymous question. I'm just going to read it as this comes. I have been challenged to quantify the benefits of including the people I research in my research teams. I love what you said in response to that. Can you repeat it and perhaps elaborate a little bit?
Yeah, so to quantify it. So then that's an interesting, I myself have had similar questions. So I'm trying to like regulate kind of the emotional response I have to that type of challenge. But I think, so there's a couple of things, right? So one, some agree, like there is actually now science and folks like myself who are attempting to like formulate the science that actually does to some degree quantify those things. Right? So you can actually say, well, actually, there's this or that study that shows that innovation is improved by greater perspective taking and more perspectives being represented on teams, that creativity, that speed or efficiency in some cases of problem solutions are increased by diversity and by inclusion. So I don't necessarily need to do that every time I want to do that on a project. You know generally that there's a science behind it. By the way, just knowing that means that my decision to be inclusive in my team is probably more evidence-based than most of the decisions that my colleagues are making about all sorts of things they're doing on research, right? That I know that there's an actual evidence base that suggests why it is that I'm doing this and that it's important to do. But I think also that if you just kind of approach it both from a moral standpoint and from an empirical standpoint, that morally we want to make sure, and representationally and symbolically, we want to make sure that the populations that we're studying are represented, because it's important for me, if I am being studied, for instance, to see myself in your research team, right? That we want me as a person who may be studied to feel that I am being acknowledged, that my voice is important, that it's not always just in the position, by the way, of the subject, which tends to be seen as the subordinate position, but is in the position of power. It can be a body that can contain knowledge, that can contain research skill, right? And it's important to demonstrate that. And that's why you want symbolically those people to be a part of that team. But also scientifically, you will get different information from me based on who's asking me questions, right? Or based on who designs the survey. And you will understand my responses differently too. In fact, I wouldn't suggest that just, for instance, having a Black person on your research team means that you now understand what Kwan says when he's a research subject. But what I would suggest is that, yeah, having more representation on your research team probably means that you're more likely to stumble on an interpretation that's as close as possible to what I would interpret what it is that I had said or conveyed to you in the data that I provide. And so having a diversity within the research team, I think objectively improves your ability to do research on a diverse set of populations. I mean, I think that from a diversity standpoint, it's actually good to have a well-rounded team studying any phenomenon. So it's not just when you're studying marginalized communities. Actually, you can have I understand a lot about what it means, for instance, about being a man, because like women actually did a lot of studies about what it meant to be a woman. And then women began to look at, well, you don't think a lot about being a man, Kwan, but like, I'm gonna start studying this. And I've now come to understand, I didn't really think about what it meant to be a man, because the world's kind of set up for me not to have to navigate that. And yet, when you think about it, now that there's some diversity of those people who are critiquing and studying masculinity, I now understand, oh, wait a minute, yeah, this is how my life operates in this or that way, in ways that I understand a lot more about myself and the ways that the world is, even though there was some group, studying me that didn't necessarily represent my gender. And so having that diverse group representing, or that diverse group within your research team can be important no matter what it is that you're studying. You have an engineering problem. The fact that I might have grown up in certain neighborhoods where we engaged in engineering of certain types that maybe others didn't, means that I can bring perspective to your engineering problem, even outside of studying, say, marginalized communities. And so I hope I gave you something in that answer. And I'm certainly willing to connect later for a more better articulated response to that. But it's certainly been a challenge that I've heard myself.
Thank you. I actually have a question that's more general. I guess like when I hear people often talk about inclusivity, they talk about in academia, they talk about it more generally, like academia overall. And here we're specifically talking about in inclusive criminology. And as you noted, also in indigent defense, particularly, is there something about the study of criminology that makes inclusivity in this field such an important discussion? I'm asking that as a lawyer who is not in the academia.
Yeah, I can think of a couple of things, and specifically with regard to indigent defense, to some extent with regard to research on the law itself and legal processes and legal practice. One is a science is always governed by the phenomena that it studies. Criminology is a really interesting social science field because we're essentially just studying crime. But the understanding of crime and what that is defined for us by politicians and judges and others who are making decisions about what it should be or should not be allowable within society and should or should not be allowable within the law. That is inherently a moral question. And so it means that I, as a social scientist, am actually studying morality and kind of an ethical question. And that now becomes a question of values. So when we think about that and how core a question of values and ethics is to even the really objective scientific questions that I have and that I try to answer, right? Objective to the degree that we believe that term applies. That means that we have to be really conscious then of the moral and ethical outcomes and the moral and ethical dimensions of the practice that we engage in. And law is essentially that way, right? It's essentially like a codified code of what is or is not acceptable within a society. When I think about it that way, then, because what you're studying is at its core such an issue of, and the practice that you have is such an issue of values, you absolutely have to be reflective and accommodating to the moral questions that come up with regard to that. So that'll be things like, hey, what is the potential harm that a practice, a legal practice of mine may have? And in order to really get at that, I have to talk to the people who are harmed. I have to make sure I'm talking to or including people who may understand that harm in ways that are different than I, but ways that add to a more comprehensive understanding of the potential harm I can bring about by a particular practice. And that really requires an expansive sense of knowledge and expansive set of perspectives to come to draw from. That also means, though, that you do have these symbolic and representational moral issues as well, right? What are the things that I'm conveying to the folks that I'm trying to help when the people in power, the people who are supposed to have all the knowledge and expertise, all look a way that's different from them? And how does that impact them as a part of my practice, right? Even down to what are the different policies that I will advocate for? What are the different impacts that I think are allowable, right? All policies have costs and benefits to them. Which costs are acceptable given these benefits? That judgment itself is going to be different when you come from one versus another perspective. And so since you are concerned about a particular community being impacted, then the folks making the judgments as to what's an acceptable cost for a certain benefit of one or another policy option needs to be, or at least incorporate some representation from those impacted communities, right? There's all sorts of ethical and moral questions that are at the heart of what you're doing that absolutely require an accounting for the various standpoints and perspectives that influence those moral choices. I hope that has made sense. But for that reason, I think there's all the other reasons that apply to science of a much more general sense, but the very moralistic aspect of the study of crime, of the study of law, and its objective, observable, empirical impacts means that like you cannot get away from those moral considerations. You simply can't. They're at the core of what we're doing.